all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Some of you know that I like to read, and recently I finished reading a book by Donna Friedis called The Happiness Effect. The subtitle to the book is How Social Media Drives a Generation to Appear Perfect at Any Cost. Some of her conclusions are kind of summarized in these two quotes that I lifted from the book. She writes, "One unifying and central theme emerged as the most pressing social media issue students face: the importance of appearing happy all the time, which is hard to fulfill when you are going through a tough time." Ms. Friedis interviewed over hundreds of college students on 13 campuses across the United States, plus got input from hundreds more in an online survey. And she quotes one student as saying this: "No one puts anything bad about themselves on Facebook. They only put the greatest things going on in their life. So their life on Facebook is only a part of their life, and they are only showing what's good. If all we knew about each other we learned only from social media, what she's saying is we would get the impression that life is great, that everything's good. In fact, if Humpty Dumpty were on social media and was posting about his life, we would be quoting this rhyme instead. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. He didn't get bruised. He didn't get bumped. Humpty Dumpty bungee jumped. It's all good. Nothing bad happens. But life isn't always that great. Friedis goes on to say this: social media is used only to highlight the ups of life, while the downs are more often internalized between the walls of our bedrooms, homes, and personal lives. The truth is, we all know life has its broken places. That's why we're in a series called Mending the Broken Places of Our Lives. And I want to tell you up front that at the end of the service this morning, our prayer team is going to be here to my right under the cross to pray with you about any broken area in your life, or perhaps a broken area in the lives of your friends. And we invite you to come and take advantage of this opportunity to have someone support you in prayer for the needs that you're aware of in your own life or in the life of someone you know. So this morning in our series, we want to talk about mending our broken finances. Because the truth is, finances is one of those areas of our lives that gets broken. A couple of marriage researchers, husband and wife, Landis and Landis, did a study of multiple couples over a period of time, and they found out that couples, when they began meeting with them and studying with them and reporting with them, that while they were engaged, only 2% of the couples reporting having any discussions, any disagreements about money. But 5 years into the marriage, of the couples they had initially begun to study, of those who came back to them with needs for counseling, over half of those couples were reporting that they had now frequent disagreements, frequent arguments about money. A study done of families who approached family service agencies for help and for counseling revealed that 40% of those who came to them were reporting serious disputes about money. San Francisco Chronicle article a few years ago interviewed a professional who made his career tracking down runaway husbands. And he said that the number one reason why husbands run away is because of lack of money. The guilty and emasculating notion that they can't provide a livelihood for their family drives them away. They don't have what they want, and they can't provide for their family, for their wife, what they want. That's the number one reason. The number two reason this professional said that husbands run away is because of a complaining wife who doesn't have what she wants either, and she reminds her husband of it all the time. Broken finances. one of the broken places of our lives. And it's compounded by the fact of how Americans define contentment. We define contentment as having what I want. I'm content if I have what I want. And for various reasons, there's a problem because there is a gap between what we have and what we want. There seems to always be a gap between what we have and what we want for various reasons. It could be a fixed income. It could be unemployment. It could be lower wages, higher costs of living, increased expenses. The gap could be caused by the expectation we have that we ought to be able to have more than we want, or the envy we feel at wishing we had more than we have. For various reasons, what happens in this gap is we end up living between what we have and what we want in discontent. We're just not happy in this gap between what we have and what we want. And it doesn't make any difference as to how much money you make or what your socioeconomic level is or what your income amount is. It doesn't make a difference because one Money Magazine article about money quotes this statement: "The amount you earn does not seem to determine whether or not you will have personal monetary problems. What matters is how you spend it." And studies indicate that 43% of American families spend more than they earn, trying to survive, live in discontent in the gap between what they have and what they want. When Paul wrote his letter to young Pastor Timothy, in the 6th chapter of his first letter, he gives Timothy some coaching advice about what do you say to people who are living in the gap, of discontent. And so I want us to focus our thoughts this morning on what Paul said to Timothy about people living in the gap. He talks about some of the descriptions of what it's like to live in the gap and what terms he would use to talk about people who live in the gap. For instance, in verses 9 and 10 of this chapter, he talks about people who want to get rich. Now, you need to understand that people who are rich are referring to people who make more than you do. People who have more than you have. All of us think of rich people as people who earn more than we earn. And so we are people who we want to get there. We want to be rich. We want to have more than we have. And we live in this gap. The second phrase that Paul uses is the word eager for money. We have a desire that makes the focus of our wants our priority. That's the most important thing. And we're discontent until we have what we need. We have what we want. And I needed some water. Thank you. Listen, discontent is not wanting. Discontent is not being satisfied with what I have and being dissatisfied until I get what I want. It's that never-ending craving for more. And it can be dangerous to live in the gap, always wanting more. It's the dissatisfaction that doesn't go away. And it is dangerous. It is dangerous to live in the gap of discontent. Mike and Lynn were living in the gap of discontent. They were a young married couple. They had a 3-year-old baby boy. And Mike was spending money on things he didn't need. Lynn was spending money on things that she didn't have money for. Both signs of discontent. And the financial pressure that those two behaviors created in their marriage was causing their marriage to collapse. And ultimately, they did end up separating. It is a dangerous thing to live in the gap of discontent. And what's interesting is Paul talks about some of those dangers here in his letter to Timothy. Let's look at a couple of the dangers that Paul lists in 1 Timothy chapter 6. Danger number 1. Dan Wyant was an official worker with the American Cancer Society in Ohio. And Dan lived in discontent between what he had and what he wanted. What he wanted was an addition to his house. What he wanted was more fruit trees in his backyard, in his property. What he wanted was some all-terrain vehicles. And in his want, in his gap, he began doing things he never thought he'd do. He was caught falsifying checks and fees to the amount of $8 million. He allowed his want, he allowed his discontent to lead him on a journey of rationalization and justification in his own mind that somehow landed him where maybe Dan never thought he'd be. That's one of the dangers of living in discontent. We would call it new temptations. Temptations that you wouldn't expect. In fact, Paul writes these words in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 9. People who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap. And the language here indicates that this wasn't something that was planned. They fall into it. It wasn't planned, it was unplanned, unexpected. They never thought they'd find themselves in this position. And they fall into a temptation. In classical Greek literature, that word is used for medical experiments. It's as if we were in Satan's laboratory, experimenting with Satan's equipment. Because you remember, one of Satan's equipment is discontent, because Satan lived in the gap between what he had, which was a position in heaven, and what he wanted, which was God's position. And Satan lived in that gap, and he wants us to join him. We experiment with Satan's tools. We experiment with Satan's equipment as we fall into unexpectedly unplanned temptations. And they're a trap. Paul says it's a trap. And again, in classical Greek literature, that word is used in the story about the Trojan horse. You may remember the story of the Greeks who assaulted the city of Troy for 10 years. And they couldn't break through. And finally they came up with a plan to build a large hollow wooden horse and offer it to the goddess Athena, who was the goddess of Troy. And inside that wooden horse they hid Greek soldiers. And as the horse stood outside the city gates, the city of Troy accepted it as a gift and rolled that horse inside the city gates, closed the gates. And when darkness came, the Greek soldiers inside the horse came out, opened the gates of the city, and the Greek army came in and captured the city. That's that word trap. It's a Trojan horse. And discontentment is a Trojan horse in our lives. Hidden inside that trap is what Paul refers to in verse 10 as the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. You know this is not saying money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's saying the love of money. It's focusing on my wants. It's living in the gap between what I have and what I want in discontent. That's the pressure. That is the starting point for all kinds of temptations. These may not be the hardest temptations, but they can be the hardest to resist temptations. They may not have to be big, but they might be irresistible. You might be tempted to compromise standards that you've held for a long time. Maybe it's lying to a spouse about your finances. Maybe it's justifying some sideways behaviors at work for business purposes. Maybe it's developing some questionable habits that you are surprised to find in yourself. Maybe it's engaging in behavior that you once thought was wrong, but now somehow it's permissible. The danger of new temptations. You find yourself in positions and considering things that you never thought you'd consider because of discontent. That's danger number one. Danger number two. Pat was a Long Island housewife who found herself over a 6-month period ringing up a debt load of $20,000 because she was buying on the spur of the moment things she just felt she had to have. And then she would bring the receipts home and stuff them in her drawer, hoping that the creditors would forget and that her husband would never find them. This is the second danger of living in discontent. It's the danger of impulsive spending. Paul describes it this way in 1 Timothy 6, verse 9. People who want to get rich fall into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and destruction. They want to get rich, and they fall into irrational, foolish, harmful desires. Harmful, the word harmful comes from the root word meaning volcano. It's an impulse. It explodes. I've got to have it. I've got to have it now. It's that impulsive spending. There are impulsive desires that you never thought you'd have. You know, when I worked in the grocery store in college, all the items that you have as you approach the counters, we called them impulse items. Because as people get to the counters of grocery stores, oh, I got to have this. Oh, I need to have this. It's bought on impulse. Impulsive spending. And what Paul is saying is that there are impulsive desires that can get you in over your head. They can drown you. Like a person who doesn't wait long enough after a big meal to go swimming. They're surprised when they cramp up and drown. So impulsive spending can cause you to get in over your head financially, can plunge you to where you didn't think you'd be. And we live in a society that encourages us to spend impulsively. Call now. Call the next 30 minutes. This is on sale till whatever date. They have dates on all the things they want us to buy, which I understand how they have to run a business. But the idea is that they want you to buy it now. Advertisements and commercials are aimed, they expect us to buy impulsively. And what ends up happening is we may end up impulsively spending money on things that we think we have to have, and in the process we ruin everything else that we wanted to have, that money can't buy, like a good character or integrity. Dan Wyant ruined his life. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to 65 years in prison and $1 million fine. Pat Hoffman was ruining her husband's trust, and she was ruining her family's credit rating. Mike and Lynn were ruining their marriage. The second danger of living in discontent is that we will find ourselves with impulsive spending that can ruin everything we hope for. Let's talk about danger number 3. Christian author Rick Yohn was always blaming his wife for the reason that their checkbook didn't balance, there wasn't enough money in the bank. His discontent led him to having more bills than money, and he figured it had to be her fault. And so he spent more energy and frustration thinking about his wife's failure, thinking about the need of the budget book and the bank account, than he did energy investing in his relationship with the Lord. He spent more time worrying about finances. He spent more time talking to his investment advisors, to his bankers. He spent more time thinking about his checkbook than he did thinking about the Lord, talking to the Lord, trusting Him. This is the third danger of living in discontent, and it's spiritual drifting. Timothy is written these words by Paul in verse 10. Some people eager for money have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. They wander aimlessly. Instead of trusting God to live in the gap, they end up piercing themselves with many griefs. Someone has defined discontent as a never-ending craving for what you don't have. It's the path to living a restlessly unhappy life. Many griefs. And the issue is not affluence. The issue is our affection. What's most important to us in our life? Where do we set goals? Do we have more financial goals than spiritual goals? There was a study done a few years ago of Christian young people, and among the questions that they asked and the things they discovered in the research is that these young people said they heard their moms and dads talking more about money than about anything else at home. More even than serving the Lord or loving the Lord or spiritual things. Their emphasis, the parents' emphasis, was on things other than their relationship with the Lord. Spiritual drifting, creating distance between yourself and the one you say you serve, the one you say you love. And discontent is no environment for spiritual growth. Paul writes this in the same passage in 1 Timothy 6, a few verses earlier. He said, "But godliness with contentment is great gain." What he's saying is, you want wealth, you want spiritual wealth? Discontent is not the environment in which to grow spiritual health. Contentment is the environment in which to grow spiritual health. The problem is we have learned to feed our discontent. Internet shopping, window shopping, I wish parties, walking around, the whole world in which we live, the society in which we live, teaches us to be discontent. Get another loan, get another credit card, overextend, take out a second loan. Shirley Rice, who writes about the Christian home, said this: the sin is not that you do not need a new rug, for instance, fill in the blank, nor is it that it is wrong for you to have it, but the sin is that you cannot be content with what you have until such time as you can afford a new one. Spiritual drifting, new temptations, impulsive spending, three of the dangers that Paul talks about when we live in the gap between what we have and what we don't have in discontent. Paul himself experienced living in the gap between what he had and what he might want. Paul had been a wealthy Pharisee at one point, and then he came to Christ. And then he found himself depending upon the offerings and the support of other churches. And one of those churches that supported him, Paul shared with them some of the things he learned about life and about living in the gap. We pick it up in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. And Paul wants to make sure that the Philippian church, as Paul talks about money, he wants to make sure the Philippian church doesn't misinterpret him, that he's not complaining. And so Paul says this: I'm not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. There's the gap. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or living in want. Interesting phrase Paul uses in verse 11. I have learned to be content. Learned to be content. This meant that for Paul, he was living in the gap between what he had and what he wanted, content. Content in that gap. What had he learned? What can we learn about living in that gap? So here's my take-home thought for you as we dive into some of the things we can learn about how to be content. Learning to be content will go a long way toward helping you live in the gap between what you have and what you want. What did Paul have to say? What helped Paul learn to be content? Let me suggest a couple of things, a couple of keys. Key number one, admit that you cannot buy contentment. Admit it right up front. George Foushee wrote a book called You Can Be Financially Free. And in that book he says discontent can be described in one word: misery. It is a constant cycle of wanting, shopping, buying, and still wanting more. It is having an empty bank account, bills you can't pay, and not being satisfied. So maybe you could think of it this way. Discontent is a four-letter word. M-O-R-E. More. I always want more. The truth is, contentment is not related at all to money. True contentment is not related to what I possess. This is what Paul writes to Timothy back in chapter 6. He says this: for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. What Paul is saying is that things were never designed to bring contentment, because things are not permanent. If you think you can buy contentment, if you think things can bring you contentment, then you will become enslaved to wanting more and more, to buying more and more of things that don't last, the things that are not permanent. If you think things can bring you contentment, then take a look at the study done a few years ago, co-authored by the Gates Foundation, Bill Gates Foundation. In part, that report portrays the ultra-rich as, quote, lost souls who are burdened with fears and worries. You cannot buy contentment. Key number one, to living in the gap between what you have and what you want, living contentedly in that gap, is to acknowledge you cannot buy contentment. God did not design the world so that impermanent things can buy contentment. Key number 2, trust that God knows what you need. Paul told Timothy, but if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. If you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that that's kind of God's baseline for what you need. It's his definition of what you need. Food and clothing, clothing and shelter, food and clothing. It's the baseline. God knows what you need. The early Christians at Rome, for instance, were living in the gap between what they had and what they used to have and what they want. The government had taken away some of their possessions. The writer of Hebrews was writing to these Roman Christians living in the gap, and this is what he says about them. You sympathized with those Christians who have been arrested and put in prison, and you joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property. Now they had stuff that was theirs that were being taken away. How did they respond? Because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. They knew their contentment did not come from what they had, didn't come from possessions. And so a few chapters later, the writer encourages them with these words. So keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. These words echo the words of Paul, and they're worth digging into a little bit, because the words that the writer of Hebrews quotes comes out of the experience of the children of Israel in the Old Testament. Be content with what you have is easy to say, hard to do. And the children of Israel in the Old Testament are poster children for people living in the gap. Their gap, it was Egypt on the one hand, the promised land on the other. And if you know anything about the story of the children of Israel, you know that their story mirrors the dangers of discontent that we've talked about. The new temptations in the wilderness, the impulsivity to want to return to Egypt, the spiritual drifting from their relationship with God, but choosing other gods. It was all there. And they lived in the gap, and what was being said to those people in that day, the writer of Hebrews was repeating to the Roman Christians in their day. What was said to those children of Israel as we back up the camera? Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6, Moses' last message to the people. This is what he says to them. People living in a gap, people who had been discontent. He says this, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them, your enemies. For the Lord your God goes with you. And here's the phrase that the writer of Hebrews used. For he will never leave you nor forsake you. Listen, God knows what you need. You may not always like what he provides, but he knows what you need. God provided food for the children of Israel in the Old Testament, quail and manna, which they didn't particularly care for, but it was an indication, you know what? God knows what you need. He's able to provide. So trust that God knows what you need. Some of you have heard me tell the story about when I was facing the possibility with 4 children and a wife to support of losing my job. And I was thinking to myself, what would I do? Where would I go? I mean, I trained myself for ministry all these years. What would I do? And we were living in northern Wisconsin, cold Wisconsin at the time. And I thought, well, we could always move to Florida, and I could buy a tent, we could live in a park, and I could go work at Burger King. That's honestly that was my worst case scenario. And I said, Lord, you know what we need. You know our situation. So if that's what you want to have happen in my life, have at it. I trust you because you know what I need. And so we trusted him. Now that never happened. Never had to buy a tent. Still don't own a tent. But the point is that if I'm going to live in the gap between what I have and what I want in contentment, I'm going to have to trust that God knows what I need. Our problem is our need meter is broken. We aren't able to distinguish oftentimes between what we need and what we want. So one author has suggested, one financial counselor has suggested that every time you think you need something, you have to have it. Write it down and then wait 3 to 6 months and find out, do I still need it? Now, I will tell you, I can get very impulsive buying books. I go through a Christian magazine, Christianity Today or Leadership Journal, there's a new book out of the market. Every year, Christianity Today magazine has a whole issue dedicated to new books. And I go, got to have that one. Oh, got to have that. This is a great book. Got to have that one. And so I've started writing down all these books that I've got to have. And it's on actually a Word document on my laptop. And over the years, I've gathered all these books. I call it my Christmas book list. Because if my kids ever ask, Mom, what can I get Dad for Christmas? Here's a bunch of books you can think about getting me. So I've written, copy and paste all these books over the years that I just had to have. And it's about 3 or 4 pages long now, all these books. And whenever I add a new one, I just added a new one this past week, I put it on there and then I wait. And I scroll back down through those 4 pages and I'm going, what was I thinking? I thought I needed this book. I thought this it really had. So the problem is our need meter is broken. So ask God to help us discern the difference between our needs and our wants. Trust that He knows our need. So admit that you can't buy contentment. Trust Him that He knows what you need. Now contentment doesn't mean that we deny that we have wants. I mean, we have things that we want. I could give you a list of things that I want. But the difference between a contented Christian and a discontented Christian is that a contented Christian can live in the gap. They don't have to have what they want to be satisfied. What this does is this removes the option of Christian complaining. Because what complaining does is it is a slap of God in the face. It is a libel of His character. Christian complaining says God doesn't know, God doesn't care, and if He did know and care, He can't do. And so when I realize that I can trust God to know what I need, it removes the option of Christian complaining. What did Jesus say in Matthew 6? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. Contentment comes from trusting that God knows what I need. Key number 3, accept responsibility for your own contentment. In the story I told you a while ago about Mike and Lynn, you can read their story in a book by Amy Ross Young called It Only Hurts Between Paydays. But if you read their story, what you'll find is their journey back to financial wholeness began with their learning to repeat 4 words. Are you ready? We cannot afford it. They realized that to be financially free meant being free enough to say, I may want that. I don't have to have that to be satisfied. I don't have to have that to be happy. I can be content with what I have. Toward the end of Paul's discussion about being content, he mentions several steps we can take in accepting responsibility for our own contentment. Look at the verbs he uses. In verse 11, he says, flee from all of this. Run away. Last week we talked about putting distance between yourself and the wrong choice that you may be facing. Here we're talking about what is it that you do that feeds your discontent? What magazine do you look through? What stores do you walk by? What people do you compare yourself with? Where does pride enter in? Where does comparison with the friends or family? What is it that's feeding the discontent? Flee, run away, create as much distance from you and that temptation as possible. The second verb he uses is follow. Follow righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, gentleness. Do you notice that all of those things that Paul lists are things that money cannot buy? Instead of following after wanting things that money can buy, I need to start pursuing and wanting things that money can't buy. Ecclesiastes says a good name is something that you can't buy. I want my kids to be focused on things that money can't buy. Are there things we want? Sure. But we follow after things that are good for our spiritual health, our character, the qualities that Paul lists here. Focus on those. The kind of people you are, kind of person you are, kind of friend you are. Focus on those kinds of things. Make that a source of contentment. And the third verb he uses here is the word fight. Sometimes it is a battle. And listen, it's not won once and for all. For some of us, it is a daily battle to live in contentment. But it is a fight. And what this verb suggests is you are not a victim. You cannot blame someone else for your discontent. You need to accept responsibility for your own contentment. Flee, follow, fight. Key number 4, ask the Lord for his help. Now before I jump into this point in particular, let me say a word about asking other people for help. Some of us are in situations where our budgets are out of control. Money's been an issue. We've been highly unorganized. We've been impulsively spending. It's created tension in relationships, and on. We could talk about the dangers of living in discontent. But there are some resources that are available to you that I want to point you to if you need help in this area. The first is the Right Now media, which those of you who are on the Trinity mailing list might have received an email about this resource that Trinity Alliance Church has obtained for you. It's free of charge to you. There are some supporting notes and so forth that you may have to, workbooks that you may have to purchase if you want to, but you don't have to. But there are instructions that were sent in an email to you, and if you want to know more and didn't get the email, Pastor Bob can help you with that. But there are close to 20,000 videos, tutorials, teachings, and so forth on various topics. And if you go to Right Now Media on the left-hand side, there's a category called Biblical Finances. You click on that category, and I'm going to say there may be 30 different teaching lessons, and some of them are very practical about how to set up a budget and so forth. It's available for you, and that's a place for you to go for help in your own time frame. And then there are some public consumer credit agencies that can help you manage and organize your finances. They usually don't charge anything. You can look them up on the internet, and they're available to you. And then there are some folks here at Trinity who've learned how to manage their money and make budgets and so forth. They may be able to help you. Pastor Bob, if you want to ask him for some direction there, they may be able to help you. What I'm saying is you don't have to drown. You don't have to be plunged in over your head. Years ago, I was counseling a young couple who were to get married, and one of my sessions, I bring in my budget plan that Kathy and I have, and we started it 3 years into our marriage when we went to a one-income family. Probably should have started it when we were 2 incomes, but we started it when we were one income. And I bring in, back then it was a book. Now it's, my wife has her Quicken books online. Confession here, I still use the hard copy. I love the tactile approach. Anyway. But with this young couple, I brought in our budget book, and I walked them through how we set up a budget and the weekly paid, everything, and manage it and so forth. And Jamie was the husband's name, and he thanked me, and Jamie and Annette set up this budget. And about a year later, Dale, Jamie's father-in-law, Annette's father, comes in to see me, and the father-in-law tells me that the son-in-law has showed the father-in-law the budget system, and could I show Dale how to do it too? So there are some people here at Trinity who have operated on budgets, and they can help you. They can show you what they do to stay above water, to live in the gap between what they have and what they want. So there are those kinds of resources. So ask for help before it ruins you, before it ruins your relationship, before it plunges you where you never thought you'd be. There are resources. So having said that, let's talk about asking the Lord for his help. We go back now to the Hebrews passage where we read words like, God will supply and be content with what you have, and I'll never leave you alone. And we read these words in the next verse. So we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? Now, this quote from Hebrews 13 actually comes from the life of David. in Psalm 118. In Psalm 118, David is living under pressure. Pressure from all sides. People pressure, living pressure, no doubt on the run, financial pressure, all kinds of pressures that he's feeling around him. And this is what David writes in Psalm 118, verses 5 and 6. In my anguish, and maybe that's a good word to talk about financial pressure. In my anguish, I cried to the Lord, and he answered me by setting me free. The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? That's the quote the writer of Hebrews is using to encourage his Roman Christians who were living in the gap. What David is saying is that God set him free from the pressures that were facing him. When you and I live in the gap between what we have and what we want, there are pressures that can weigh on us, pressures that can make us feel trapped and bound. And what we are saying here is that you can ask God for help. Would you help me with this pressure? Would you help me with living in the gap between what I have and what I want? Some of you heard the story of years ago when Kathy and I and our kids moved from Wisconsin to Florida. We put our house on the market in Wisconsin and moved to Florida. With an advanced loan from the church in Florida, we were able to purchase another home while our home in Wisconsin was still for sale. Well, our home in Wisconsin was for sale for 2 years and 3 months. And it was a long, long time. And I remember the day when it was just, we had some renters, yes, but sometimes it didn't cover everything, and there was always a water heater to be replaced or a wall to be strengthened, something else that had to be done to the house up in Wisconsin. And it was like an empty hole in your pocket. You never knew what was coming next. And so the pressure was there. And I remember one day throwing myself across our bed and saying, God, I can't take this. I can't take this anymore. This is so much pressure, and I'd never knowing and wondering if we'll have enough. I can't take this anymore. I asked him for help. I remember the day that during this time that Kathy and I wanted to get something for our home. And we were headed out the front door. And Kathy turned to me and said, Rich, can we afford this? And I said to her, no, we can't. So we turned around. Rather than feeding our discontent, rather than going out and impulsively buying something that we just had to have, we turned around and came in and sat down and enjoyed a nice Saturday afternoon at home. But you have to ask the Lord for help. He wants to help you. He helped David in the pressures that he was feeling. He helped Paul. Listen to what Paul said when he talked about learning to be content. He said, there's a secret to being content, and here it is. I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. So ask him for that strength. Listen, the enemy does not want you content. God does. So if you ask God to help you, yes, the enemy won't like it, but I think you're doing a good thing when you ask God to do something that the devil doesn't like, don't you think? And God will help you with that pressure that you feel. Admit you can't buy contentment. Trust that he knows your need. Accept responsibility for your own contentment, and then ask him for help. Ask him for help. As the worship team comes, I want to share one more piece of good news with you. And that comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 9, where Paul writes, For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. What this verse is painting a picture of is Jesus Christ lived in the gap. He had everything he could have wanted in heaven, but he came here. And the gap between here and there, he lived in. And we became not financially rich, but spiritually rich. We became rich in the things that money can't buy. That's the Jesus that you are asking to join you in the gap that you live in. Jesus, you've lived in the gap. You know what it's like. Would you come join me in my gap? Because there is a gap. There is a gap. The question is, what is in your gap?